So we are in the final week of our series called The Daniel Dilemma. If you've missed it, missed a week, missed the whole thing, it's okay. They're all online. You can be one of 20 people that listen to them during the week. It's great. You can go on there, you listen, and you can catch up with them online. But it's been a lot of fun going through this. This is the first time that I know of in the time that I've been preaching that I've taken a more extended look at Daniel, and it's been a lot of fun for me. Hopefully it's been fun for you as well. But there has been an overarching theme, as we mentioned earlier, on the book of Daniel and what it means and what we should take out of it. And it's this: despite current circumstances, God is in control. Despite everything that's going on in the book of Daniel, that God is in control, that God is active, that God is for Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in turn, God is for the exiles in Israel, despite everything that is going on. For Jews reading Daniel later, this had to be great encouragement to them, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And hopefully, as we've been going through this, it's been encouragement to you as well. That God is with us, that God does not leave us, that God is for us and not against us. So Daniel 6 takes place later than the stories that we've done over the previous 5 weeks. There is a new king, King Darius. Darius will set up his own government to his liking, as most kings, presidents, governors, and whatever do. Sets in part his cabinet and all the people that are going to lead. He sets in place 120 satraps. They go around, they have their own areas that they are leading and that they are governing. And then Darius puts in place 3 other administrators, governors, presidents, whatever you want to call them, divides the kingdom and says, you are in charge of maybe 40 satraps each. If I do the math right, it's probably not right, but that's okay. I tried. And so they are in charge of all the satraps. And then Darius has in mind to set Daniel, a foreigner, an exile, someone who does not worship Babylon's gods. He has in mind to set him over the affairs of the kingdom. Because the king didn't run the kingdom. The head administrator ran the kingdom. The king just got all the accolades and all those sorts of things. And so, as you might imagine, this makes the satraps very jealous. They have worked hard to come into their position. They have these exiled noblemen that have come in, these young men that have been trained in the ways of Babylon. Some of them have rose through the ranks as Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego have. In fact, if you remember from chapter 1, it said that Daniel and the others were 10 times better as wise men than the Babylonian wise men. And so there's this jealousy that is breeding amongst the satraps, amongst the Babylonians, seeing these exiles, these foreigners, these people who worship another god, moving ahead and advancing in front of them when it comes to their careers. And so the satraps think to oneself, they start looking and saying, how can we sabotage Daniel's reign? How can we sabotage his rule? And they start looking at him and all the things that he does, and they come back and they meet together, the conspirators do, and they're like, there's no corruption in this man. Daniel is a man of integrity. He is trustworthy. He is not negligent in anything that he does. We are unable to bring charges against him in order to get rid of him. Now, just a side note, because this could be a whole separate sermon in and of itself. So we're going to do it in like 15 seconds. Ready? As Christians, we should aspire to be like Daniel, where there is no corruption in us, where we are men and women of integrity, where we are trustworthy, and where there is no negligence in us. We should aspire that sort of living for our leaders within the church and the leaders that we support in the world. That we are people of integrity. We serve Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life. And so we should be people of integrity in all ways. All right, end the little segue sermon right there. You might find that more helpful than anything else we do. I don't know. We'll see. You can let me know later. So, since there are no charges that these satraps can bring against Daniel, they're like, this guy is incorruptible. They say, we have to use his God against him. He worships the God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He worships Yahweh, not the Babylonian gods. Let's use that against him. And they know that Daniel is committed to the practice of his faith. They know that Daniel is praying 3 times a day, faithfully to God. And so they go to the king, they go to Darius, a little flattery here and all this stuff. Oh, king, you're mighty, you're great. We think that over the next 30 days, remember, he's setting up his new government. Over the next 30 days, you should create an edict that anyone who prays to any other person or thing other than you should be put to death through the lion's den. And part of this, like we should know, is that Babylonians and Persians did not elevate their kings to gods like the Egyptians did. And so most likely what is happening here, it's a loyalty test. That oftentimes people in power, and especially people with extreme power, are paranoid about losing power. And they become paranoid about losing power that they put forth loyalty tests to see who will bend the knee, who will kiss the ring, who will do whatever is necessary so that the king, or whoever it might be, will know who is loyal and who is not. Then the king knows who to execute and get rid of. That way there's less problems in the kingdom. And so this is what's happening here. It's not about worship. It's about a loyalty test. Who is loyal to Darius? As Darius says, that sounds like a great idea. I would love to know who's not loyal to me. And so they put this in place. It cannot be revoked. The king, once it's signed, cannot go back on his word. And so the satraps, the conspirators are excited about this because they know they've got Daniel. And so when Daniel hears about the edict, he does what he always has done. He goes to his house. He goes to an upper room, it says. He opens the windows, which are pointed towards Jerusalem, which he would be thinking of the temple, in the place of worship, the holy city. And he prays 3 times a day faithfully. He doesn't hide it at all. The windows are open. I remember a coloring book page or something somewhere that showed Daniel on his knees praying with the window with like conspirators like listening in like this, Like it's a great little scene. Like Daniel is just boldly praying, doing what he has always done, confidently and without fear. The conspirators hear him praying. They've got witnesses to it. They go back to the king, and they kind of want to lead the king on because they know the king loves Daniel. The king's ready to put Daniel in charge of the whole kingdom. The king doesn't think a bad thing about Daniel. And so they say to him, like, oh, king, didn't you put this edict out that anyone who prayed to anyone but you over these next 30 days would be thrown to the lion's den? And the king was like, that's what I said. And then they're like, there is Daniel. And the king's like, oh, no, not him. And they're like, we have found him praying 3 times a day to his God and not towards you. And the king gets his pit in his stomach because he loves Daniel and he's come to respect Daniel. And Daniel's holding an honored position in his kingdom. And he knows that Daniel is loyal and faithful and all those sorts of things. And the satraps, the conspirators say, remember, this sort of thing can't be gone. You can't go back on it. And so the king finally, as the sun goes down, says, let it be so. And so Daniel is tossed into the lion's den. A stone is rolled over the lion's den, and the king uses his ring in wax to put his signet there so that everyone knows that they cannot enter it. King Darius spends all night without food, without entertainment, without joy, all the things that a king might enjoy, because he is so sick in the stomach about Daniel, knowing that he is being ripped to pieces by these lions in the lion den. When dawn broke, Darius went to the lion's den, had the stone removed, and called out, maybe in desperation, Daniel, are you there? And Daniel responds, declaring that his God has sent an angel to shut the mouths of the lions who are in there. And when Daniel was brought out of the lion's den, he had no wounds on him. And now, lest anyone think that these lions just weren't hungry, maybe they'd had 10 or 15 other people that they'd eaten earlier in the day, and they just weren't hungry by the time Daniel got down there. The king, once Daniel was brought out, called all the conspirators, everyone that came to him and flattered him and set Daniel up. They took all of the family of the conspirators, including their children. It's not a really pretty scene. And threw them into the lion's den. And it's recorded there, if you go on and read the rest, it says, before the people hit the ground, the lions had already pounced on them and consumed them. These were hungry junkyard dog lions that were ready to rip apart anything that came in there. God sent an angel to shut the mouth of the lions. This, in a way, this is called an ordeal in this culture and stuff, but it was a way of declaring whether you were guilty or innocent. And by coming out scot-free with no wounds, Daniel was innocent for what he was accused of. And so the story of Daniel has encouraged Jews who would be reading this later on. This is part of why it's written down, especially during the time of Jesus and before that, when the Romans would have been occupying Israel. Israel at this time wasn't like exiled outside of Israel, but they were exiles within their own country. As the Roman soldiers came in, Roman and Greek culture was imported in, the temple was desecrated, later destroyed, all these things. They were exiles living in their own land. And the story of Daniel would have been one that encouraged them, that despite their current circumstances, that God is in control. And this doesn't mean that God causes the evil in the world that's going on and in our world today. But it's the idea that God is in control means that God has given you and me free will, and the people around us free will to do what we choose. Some of us choose to do good. Some of us choose to do evil. We sin. And because of that, there is a rippling effect of the consequences of our sin. My sin doesn't just affect me. It affects Andrea, and it affects my children, and it affects the people around us. And then when governments and nations sin, it affects all people who are in there, and we see brokenness and the hurt in the world. God doesn't approve of all that stuff. God allows it to happen because God has given us free will. God said, make good choices, live godly. And in doing so, in doing that, God still works within the brokenness in the world. And so when we say God's will is taking place, it's not that God wills these bad things to happen, it's that through bad things, God will reveal himself to us. God will work in ways that we never understood or might be ready for. God is at work often in ways we cannot immediately see or understand in the world. And so our present day is not much different than Daniel's. We live in a culture that does not fear God. We live at a time when tyrants and despots demand worship and fealty, and often using religious language to make their demands palatable. Leaders and government officials are intent on lining their pockets and the pockets of other ultra-rich at the expense of the poor. And in this final account of our series, we want to look at what does Daniel offer us and teach us about living faithfully in a culture of compromise, in a culture that goes against so much about what we read about and learn in the Bible. The first thing is that living faithfully requires Christians to be a non-anxious presence in the world. Now, if you've never heard of the term non-anxious presence, it's this. I heard it in counseling classes first in seminary. And a non-anxious presence is someone who can remain calm in spite of all that's going on around them. Someone that can be, I won't quite say anxiety-free, but will be, in a sense, a calm presence because we are rooted in the peace that comes from Jesus Christ. And so one way we think about this is, the easy image that I shared earlier is like of a duck, right? The duck is calm on top of the water when it's swimming. What's it doing underneath the water? It's like paddling like crazy, right? Like that's the idea of a non-anxious presence. That we are calm and we present calmness, even though the inside sometimes we're wrestling with stuff. And so as a pastor and a counselor, when someone comes to me and we do a counseling session or they're sharing something, like there's things I've heard that would cause my eyebrow to raise or maybe my jaw to drop. Okay? Not with any of you, right? Not at all. This is at another church a long time ago, that sort of thing, right? Like, but a non-anxious presence sits there without reacting anxiously or surprised. Not because we're not, but because it is more healing and helpful and beneficial for us to remain calm. So that we can be the non-anxious presence while someone struggles with their anxiety, their worry, their fear, their hurt. They can bring that to a non-anxious person. And so Daniel does this throughout the book. And when you go back through and read the story of Daniel, you go back through and read Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we went through them. They calmly faced whatever it was that they had to face. Now, maybe Daniel doesn't tell us all the things and that they worried about. But what we see here time and time again is Daniel knew that the edict has been signed. You pray, you die. What does Daniel do? He calmly goes and prays. He doesn't throw a fight. He doesn't protest loudly. He's not freaking out and trying to get out of the country or something like that. He prays to his God like he always has. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when they're brought before the fiery furnace, they said, we believe that God will save us. And if God doesn't, oh well. God is still God, and God is still in control and over everyone. They had a calmness, a non-anxious presence. And we need that in our world. We need that today because we live in a world full of anxiety, worry, and fear. Christians can live faithfully by being agents of peace. And this counterculture living, as fear and worry are used to sell everything. Think about what, your favorite news source and your favorite, internet sites and stuff, they often use fear, the things that we worry about the most, to get clicks on the internet, which makes them money, by the way. It's not that they have your interest in mind. They do that, they sell fear, and it's important for us as Christians to be a non-anxious presence. Jesus tells us in Matthew 6:25, don't worry about your life. Paul says in 2 Timothy, he says, for God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power and love and a sound mind. Later on in Galatians, Paul says this in chapter 4. He says, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Paul writes here, don't be anxious. I think that's a little better than telling your spouse to calm down, right? Like, Paul says, that doesn't get you very far. But like Paul's saying, don't be anxious. Why? Because we should, through prayer and praise and thanksgiving, seek the peace of Christ in our life. That surpasses all understanding. That as Christians, we should have a peace that defies what everyone else in the world understands. Because we have Jesus in our hearts. And so if we want to live out our faith in a culture of compromise, then we must learn to live as a non-anxious presence because we have the peace of knowing that God is in control. And we must seek and ask for the peace that comes from surrendering our lives to Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace. Secondly, Christians in an age of compromise, we need to be committed to practicing our faith. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were faithful in a culture of compromise precisely because they continued to practice their faith. Daniel continued to adhere to the Jewish dietary laws in chapter 1 when he was told to eat other food. That seemed like a small thing, but it created space for God to work in Daniel's life. That was a faith, that was practicing his faith. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not bow before the 90-foot gold statue because their faith declared, you shall have no other gods before me, and you shall not worship brazen images. Right? That's a practice of the faith. And even though it got them in the lion's den, God showed up powerfully and miraculously because they did this. Daniel continued to pray 3 times a day when it had been outlawed for a period of time. They practiced their faith. They did not give up on it. They did not live in fear. They were committed to doing that. And I believe that it was the practicing of their faith that allowed them to stand courageously and boldly before a leader and leaders who sought their demise. For Christians to remain faithful in our current climate, we have to practice spiritual disciplines that draw us deeper into God's love, grace, and wisdom. This wisdom part is so important. Remember, Daniel was wiser than all the other wise men. Jesus tells us to ask for wisdom if we don't have it, or James actually does, the brother of Jesus. And it's through the practicing of our faith, the reading of our Bibles, through prayer, through fasting, through worship together, through Bible study, the spiritual disciplines that we gain this. And if we're not practicing our faith in these ways and practicing disciplines, then we're missing out on the abundant life that Jesus promised. It's not to say we're not Christian, but we're missing out on the depth and the breadth and the height of God's love through the disciplines. To remain faithful in this age, we have to develop our faith through deepening spiritual disciplines that transform our lives to be more like Jesus. Lastly, Christians must commit to what is good and right. Daniel was a person who had godly character. His integrity was paramount. And as Christians, we should seek to be men and women of integrity because we are disciples of Jesus, who is truth and love. We should be committed to live as Paul called believers at Galatia when he wrote, whenever we have the opportunity, let us work for the good of all, especially for the family of faith. Now let me just kind of parse that out really quickly. The good of all, that's everyone, and especially the family of faith. In other words, you better work for good inside your church, because if you can't get along with your brothers and sisters inside the church, how are we supposed to do good outside the church? And the good that we do as Christians, the way we live out our life, the care we have for one another, is not limited to just the people in the church who look and believe and act like us. It's for all people that we are to work for good and right for everyone. We are called to work for the good, and what I would say is the flourishing of all people. And this starts in the church, but it does not exclude anyone. The prophet Jeremiah writes to exiles living in Babylon as well, and he shares a message from God on how exiles are to live in Babylon. And hear this, Jeremiah 29:5. It's right before all your favorite passage, your favorite Bible verse. Jeremiah 29:5. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons. Give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there, and do not decrease, but seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find welfare. Go back and read that verse later today, 29 verse 5, Jeremiah. And here's the thing. God tells, through Jeremiah, exiles living in a foreign land, under foreign occupiers, worshiping foreign gods, doing things that Israel would have seen as detestable, seek the welfare of your city. Don't change what you do as a community for you to flourish. Help the entire city to flourish. Because when it flourishes and when you flourish, you will flourish. And it's this idea that you're blessed to be a blessing. That we are blessed to be a blessing to those around us. The exiles were to seek the welfare of the city that sent them into exile. And as Christians, we are to seek the welfare and the flourishing of our neighbors and those who might be against us, because we witness to our faith when we see our community flourish. Friends, we have a responsibility as Christians to look around Milford and Lincoln and Ellendale and Harrington and Frederica and Felton. I live in Camden, so yes, Camden. And say, who's not flourishing in our community? Who has been left behind? Who has been ignored? Who has been targeted? And say, how can we as Christians work for the welfare of our city and our state and of our world? This is how we are called to live as people in exile. And so as we close out the series, we need to consider Jesus' prayer in John chapter 17. Jesus prays that for his disciples that they would be in the world but not of the world. That we are not to separate ourselves out. We're not to live in a holy huddle. We're not just to stand inside the walls of the church all afraid about what's going on in the world. We're to go out into the world, but we're not to be of the world. We're to live differently. The way Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were able to live differently in Babylon. We're to live with the love of Christ, the grace of Christ, Christ's mercy, forgiveness. All those sorts of things should exude from our lives. We should be salt and light, Jesus said. Salt adds a pleasing flavor to whatever it's put on. It is a healing presence, and it preserves. Does our lives preserve and bring healing into the world that we live in? To the words we say on Facebook and Twitter and other places, and in the comments section of the whatever social media stuff and news, do our words bring a healing presence to what we do? If we want to live faithfully, if we want to see transformation in our families and our communities, we must commit to living out Jesus' teachings in the world. Our lives should be countercultural. And this will, at times as we follow Jesus, put us in the lion's den. But it will also create space for God to work in miraculous and powerful ways in us and through us. So as we come to the communion table this morning, let us come with renewed commitment to publicly live out our faith in ways that brings the peace of Christ into the world. May we choose not to live in fear, but to confidently face the world knowing that despite current circumstances, God is in control. And may we renew our commitment to practice spiritual disciplines that draw us closer to God.